Last week, at his State of the Nation address, Russia's President Putin threatened that any NATO country considering direct involvement in the war in Ukraine risked, quote, a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and therefore the destruction of civilization. Meanwhile, America's other major rival, China, is on track to double its nuclear arsenal by 2030, according to reports from the Pentagon. Is a new nuclear arms race afoot? And how dangerous would it be? Joining me now is CNN's chief national security analyst, Jim Sciutto, who has a new book out Tuesday. It's called The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. Jim, this couldn't be more timely. And as if to underscore that, you point out an incident in which the Russians almost used nuclear weapons. Describe what happened.
In researching this book, I spoke to senior U.S. officials involved in this moment, and we came much closer to the first use of nuclear weapons since Hiroshima and Nagasaki than I think we realized. Extreme concern to the point where I'm told, and this is a direct quote, that the U.S. was preparing rigorously for that very possibility. This was late summer, early fall 2022. At the time, you'll remember, Russian forces were getting pushed back from Kherson, which was their biggest prize from the invasion, and there were thousands of Russian troops that were in danger of being surrounded by Ukrainian forces. That was one input to a broader calculus which led the U.S. to an assessment that Russia was very much considering a tactical nuclear weapon strike in Ukraine. There were other pieces to it. Beyond that threat, the U.S. assessment of the Russian military doctrine as it relates to nuclear weapons use, which is somewhat foggy, it's not quite clear, was that was the kind of threat where Putin might calculate it was necessary to use a nuclear weapon. At the same time, Russian officials began to speak openly about what they claimed was a Ukrainian dirty bomb plan, a plan to have a radioactive weapon strike, which the read from the U.S. was that this was a cover.
Right. This would have been the misinformation that the Russians could then claim we had to counter with nuclear weapons because the Ukrainians were using a dirty bomb.
Absolutely. And you'll remember in the early stages of the war, there were a whole host of other false flag operations by Russia to putatively justify the invasion, which the U.S. exposed. There was one more piece to this, and this made it even far more serious, is that the U.S. received intelligence, communications among Russian military officers discussing that very possibility of a use of nuclear weapons. And this then led U.S. officials to go on really an international full-court press to prevent this from happening. Direct contact with Russian officials, getting allies on board as well, but interestingly, enlisting the help of India and China. Right. Unusual allies in this, but they calculated they didn't want this to happen either and pulled them back from the brink.
The FT recently reported on, they came across, it was leaked to them, Russian war plans with a potential war with China. And again the plan was that the Russians would use nuclear weapons, tactical nukes, much earlier in the process than anyone had ever imagined. So clearly something is going on where Russian nuclear doctrine has changed.
No question. And it has always been the case that the use of particularly a tactical nuclear weapon, battlefield nuclear weapon, of course, it's not going to destroy a city, but still devastating on the battlefield, is that it's lower on their escalation ladder than it is on the U.S. escalation ladder, and could be in response to a conventional threat, including the loss of Russian territory. And of course, this is Ukrainian territory, but Russia had claimed it was their own. Right. And the other piece that was concerning was this. Because tactical nuclear weapons are small enough, the U.S. was concerned because they weren't certain they would know if Russia had moved those weapons into place. They're small enough to move around, and they could be fired from conventional systems that were already on the battlefield. That was the other concerning piece, that they might have made the decision and the U.S. wouldn't know it.
The other piece that's really interesting in the book is how this new arms race or this new great power competition has moved into new realms. So, for example, both the Russians and the Chinese are getting very active in space.
Yeah.
Explain why.
So it's a multi-front war, and some of this has been going on for some time, but it's gotten worse. Russia and China have both tested weapons in space of a whole host of kinds. Directed energy weapons, yes, lasers in space, ramming vehicles that could take out satellites in space. And of course, you had this recent concern about the possibility of deploying a nuclear warhead to space that would then destroy satellites as well. So that is only getting hotter, that front of the war.
And I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is all happening because the U.S., A, has dominance in space,
Yes.
and B, the U.S. space dominance is what allows the U.S. to have these huge advantages on the ground because all our systems,
Yes.
our communication systems, are based in space.
Dominance and dependence, right? Our smart bombs aren't smart without GPS. Our secure communications, our sensors that sense things like the movements of Russian nuclear weapons surveillance satellites on the military side and intelligence side, but also what you and I depend on. Both Russia and China calculate that they could inflict pain on the U.S. population by taking away things that we depend on via satellite assets, even financial markets, et cetera. And then you add to that a cyber element, cyber attacks, and I talk about this a great deal in the book because those things are linked, satellites and cyber, that both Russia and China have planted cyber weapons in critical infrastructure in the U.S. that in effect could be turned on in the event of a conflict. To be fair, the U.S. has likely done the same in China and Russia, but their calculation, Russia and China's calculation, is they can cause greater pain to us.
Well, it's really fascinating and so well timed. Thank you.
Thank you.